Before we get into the exception clause, except it be for fornication, we really need to go over Deuteronomy 24. The reason being is because in Matthew 5:32, in the immediate context, Jesus brings up and quotes from Deuteronomy 24. That's the immediate context. The verse immediately before Matthew 5:32, Jesus says, "Furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce." So Jesus here is quoting from Deuteronomy 24. So it would behoove us to understand why he's quoting it and what purpose this is for. And it's good for us to understand, what does Deuteronomy 24 say? Because what a lot of evangelicals will use to support divorce and remarriage is Deuteronomy 24. They'll actually take you back under the old covenant law, rip that out, and say, we're bound to Deuteronomy 24. And I have a clip here in just a minute I'm going to play where it goes through and it shows you all the different people, Kerrigan Skelly, Keith from Y City, and evangelical preachers who say we're still under the old covenant law when it comes to Deuteronomy 24. And this is wrong for many reasons. But let me just go ahead and say the two main verses that you need to know when studying divorce and remarriage is Deuteronomy 24 in the Old Testament and Matthew 19:9 in the New Testament. These are the most, I would say, brought up and used verses in the Old Testament and the New. So the Old Testament has one main verse that people use to try to support divorce or remarriage. And the main one they use in the New Testament is Matthew 19:9. So if you know these two verses, you know the main battleground for the Old Testament justification for it and the New. So again, Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 through 4 and Matthew 19:9 in the New Testament. But even in Matthew 19, Jesus quotes from Deuteronomy 24. So again, we have to understand what this says. It says, when a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she finds no favor in his eyes because he has found some uncleanness in her. Now, this is sort of ambiguous. We don't really know what uncleanness means. It means like nakedness. But it just says, has found some uncleanness in her, and writes her a certificate of divorce. This is what Jesus was quoting from. Puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. When she has departed from his house and goes and becomes another man's wife, if the latter husband detests her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies who took her as his wife, then the former husband who divorced her must not take her back to be his wife after she has been defiled. Now, this is key. It says defiled. For that is an abomination before the Lord. And you shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So they'll say, look, they'll pull this into the new covenant and say, look, right here, it says clear as day, if you try to even go back to your former wife, that God calls it an abomination. Deuteronomy 24, it's called an abomination. So you can't go back to your wife. That's the argument that they'll try to use. But friends, we're not under the old covenant law. In fact, the Bible has curses for those who try to place anybody under the old covenant law. Look at Galatians 5. It says, stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Indeed, I, Paul, say to you that if you become circumcised, so he was just talking about even just becoming circumcised is enough to make you accursed and cut off from Christ. Listen up. Christ will profit you nothing. And I testify again to every man who becomes circumcised that he is a debtor to keep the whole law. You see, the law was an entire package. It's not like you can just pick out, oh, okay, I'll take Deuteronomy 24, I'll take some of that, I'll take some of Deuteronomy over here, and then the rest, yeah, it doesn't apply to us. No. You're a debtor to keep the whole law just from trying to be circumcised. That's it. You have become estranged from Christ. You who attempt to be justified by law, you have fallen from grace. This is very serious. Remember, Paul says, if anyone comes preaching another gospel, let him be accursed. He was talking about brethren who were coming in trying to put people back under the law. And that's what these men are doing, as I'm going to show you here in a minute. But he goes on to contrast walking in the Spirit with walking by the flesh. And notice what he says here. He says, but if you are led by the Spirit, you are not under the law. Did you catch that? If you're led by the Spirit, you're not under the law. Well, how much of the law? Paul just says the law, meaning all of it. And then look at this. Now the works of the flesh are evident, which are, and look at the first thing here. Paul immediately goes to adultery. So we see a contrast here. Either you're walking by the Spirit and you're not under the law, including Deuteronomy 24, or you're walking by the flesh in things like adultery. Now, isn't that ironic that these men who try to put you under Deuteronomy 24 and say it's okay to divorce and remarry, a lot of them are either in adultery or promoting other people, saying it's okay for them to be in adultery. Now, isn't this interesting? Because Paul makes a contrast. You're either led by the Spirit and you're not under the law, Deuteronomy 24, or you're walking in things like adultery, fornication, uncleanness, lewdness. So which one is it? You have to pick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play a clip showing you, because I don't want anyone to say that I'm misquoting them or that's not really what they said. So I'm going to play a clip showing you, proving to you that these men, along with many evangelicals, this is one of the predominant arguments out there. This is a very popular argument. They'll try to say that we are under Deuteronomy 24. It's interesting because most of these people say we're not under really any of the Old Testament law, maybe, one or two things here and there, but for the most part, they say we're not under the law, but just Deuteronomy 24, and some of them may say tithing or something else, but isn't that interesting? So when it applies to them, or when it benefits them, when it allows them to walk in adultery and sin, then they use the Mosaic law. See that? But when it doesn't benefit them, then okay, we're not under that. We don't need to go by that. I'm just going to show you, because it's clear as day. These men say that we have to abide by Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 still applies to us Christians in the new covenant today. And remember, again, listen to this in the context of Galatians, where he says that you've fallen from grace if you try to put somebody under the law. You've become estranged from Christ, and you've been cut off from Christ. Think about that. Okay, let's go ahead and take a listen.
And in these two verses, I don't think he's correcting anything from the Old Testament. I don't even think he's really adding anything or going deeper to what Deuteronomy 24 says. I think really he's just reaffirming it.
But Deuteronomy 24 makes it clear that if you divorce, or if you are divorced from your second spouse, or your second spouse dies, and you go back to your first spouse, that it's an abomination to the Lord. This scripture has not passed away. This is almost exactly the same thing Jesus is giving in Matthew 19.
Because Jesus, he has the right to change things from the Old Testament to New Testament. He's done it before. He can do it again. But let's see if he actually changes it, okay? And I say to you, whoever divorces his wife, except for sexual immorality and marries another, commits adultery. And whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. That sounds exactly like Deuteronomy 24 to me. It almost sounds like he's just putting it in different words. He's not quoting it verbatim, but he's promoting the same exact doctrine.
Does that mean we got to do the law of Moses to be justified? No. Read verse 26. Therefore, if the uncircumcision keep the righteousness of the law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? This is why Paul's hard to understand. See, you would read verse 13 and think, well, wait a minute, I got to do the law, but wait a minute, for Romans chapter 7, Galatians chapter 4, it makes it clear I don't. Which is it? That's why Paul's hard to understand. If you're hearing the law, that doesn't make you just, but doing the law. Does that mean all the law of Moses? No, the righteousness of the law. I.e., if you want my terminology, the moral aspects. And by the way, Deuteronomy 24 with marriage, that's moral. Is marriage moral? Or is marriage governmental law? No. Is marriage ceremonial? Is it sacrificial? Is it a food law? Oh. What is marriage? A moral law. God hasn't changed his mind on that. When Jesus came in the flesh, he just clarified it. In fact, he talked about, once again, the innocent woman that Deuteronomy 24 does not address.
See, Christ didn't overrule. He confirmed what Moses said. It's very clearly, as we look at these verses, in the context of which they're given, in the situation that what was spoken in Matthew 19, what he was talking about in Luke 16 and Matthew 5.
Deuteronomy 24 is one of the reasons why I take the permissive view. Now, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the things, because it shows me something of the heart of God, allowing the innocent party to divorce and remarry. And it's not prohibited under Moses. That is telling us something of the character of God. And I think it's a valid thing to think about. John MacArthur pointed out in one of his messages,
"But whosoever shall put away his wife not on the grounds of fornication, and shall marry another, commits adultery. And whosoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery." And Jesus says the same thing he said in Matthew 5:31 and 32. The same thing in Deuteronomy 24. When you get a divorce for other than adultery, you proliferate more adultery. And that verse is not a new verse. That's not a new thought. That's not a new truth. That's Deuteronomy 24 all over again. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. The same statement exactly is made there. It's nothing new.
Deuteronomy 24.
Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 is Deuteronomy 24.
And by the way, Deuteronomy 24,
He confirmed what Moses said.
Deuteronomy 24 is
Deuteronomy 24.
Okay, so you heard them yourselves. They're very clearly and unambiguously saying we are under Deuteronomy 24 still today, that Jesus didn't change anything up at all. In fact, he just enforced it. If anything, he gave women rights. So he just expanded on it, but he doubled down and reinforced Deuteronomy 24. This is a big argument. But you know, what's interesting is these same men that preach are under Deuteronomy 24, they don't preach anything about what it says later on in Deuteronomy 24. It says when you become married, you actually can't go off to war, or you can't go off into any business or anything like that for a year. You have to stay at home for a year. Now, when's the last time you've heard any of these men preach anything about this right here? Because you heard Keith say, well, marriage has to do with the moral law, even though there's no such thing in the Bible as differentiating between moral law versus sacrificial laws and food laws. And it doesn't break up the law. It just says the law. Galatians, Romans, it just says the law. So this is completely false that there's these different categories and you have to abide by certain categories. That's just not true. No, if you're under one part of the law, you have to keep the whole law. And we've died to the law. Even the 10 Commandments, as Romans 7 says, talks about thou shalt not covet. We've died to that law, the 10 Commandments even. But it's interesting, they don't talk about this right here. Or how about in the very next chapter, Deuteronomy 25, they don't talk about this one either. In the Old Covenant, if your brother's wife died and you and your brother were living together, you had to marry his wife. And this would happen if you refuse to marry your brother's wife. This is what she was supposed to do. She was supposed to come to him in the presence of the elders, remove his sandal from his foot, spit in his face, and answer and say, so shall it be done to the man who will not build up his brother's house. Now, when's the last time you've heard these hypocrites preach this one? Because you heard Keith, he said, we're still under the moral law or marriage laws. Marriage is moral, so therefore we're under that law. So how come you don't hear him preach this right here? That, hey, brother, did you know you have to marry your brother's wife if he dies? Did you know that? No, they don't preach that. Why? Because they're hypocrites, okay? They pick and choose which parts of the law they want to put you under that benefit them, that allow them to go off in their adultery, just like I showed you in Galatians. And they want you to believe that you have to keep Deuteronomy 24, just the first 4 verses, okay? Don't go beyond that. Don't go beyond that. And definitely don't go to Deuteronomy 25. But you have to keep the first 4 verses of Deuteronomy 24. Really? Really? Well, okay, how about this one? Do they keep this one? Do they preach this one right here? Deuteronomy 23. So the chapter right before Deuteronomy 24, it says, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. Now, I know that some of these guys say that you cannot swear an oath because they take Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount literally, which, by the way, is in the context of Matthew 5 when it talks about adultery. In that same chapter, it talks about not taking oaths. And again, in James, it talks about not taking oaths. In fact, these men, Kerrigan and Keith from Wise City, they will go so far as to say that you're in disobedience. You're sinning if you take an oath to become, let's say, a police officer or a politician or whatever else, that you cannot swear an oath. Even if you're in court, you cannot swear on the Bible. And if you do, you're sinning. And the implication is you would go to hell if you're a sinner. So right here in Deuteronomy 23, do they preach this one? When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it. For the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. So how come they don't preach this one? Well, because Jesus did away with it in Matthew 5, as we're going to see. Just like he did away with Deuteronomy 24, as I'm going to prove to you. Or how about this one? How about Deuteronomy 21? So just a few chapters prior. If a man has two wives, one loved and the other unloved. So here it's talking about polygamy. So how come you don't hear them preaching on this one? That, hey, this is what you do if you have two wives. No. Why? Because polygamy has been done away with. Polygamy is no longer permitted. It's the same exact thing with taking oaths, and it's the same exact thing with divorce and remarriage. It was permitted for a time, as I'm going to show you, but it's no longer permitted. Jesus took away the permission, and that's going to be clear as we go into this. But let's go ahead and now look at the context of Matthew 5. Because don't just look at Matthew 5, 31 and 32 in a vacuum. You got to look and see, what was Jesus saying before? What was he getting at? What was he doing in the Sermon on the Mount? So we can see what he was and what he wasn't doing. Jesus was not simply just reaffirming the old covenant. And for people to say this is absolutely mind-blowing to me. I mean, you heard them. They said clear as day that things like he was just reaffirming Deuteronomy 24.
Deuteronomy 24.
Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 is Deuteronomy 24.
And by the way, Deuteronomy 24.
He confirmed what Moses said.
Deuteronomy 24 is
Deuteronomy 24.
Well, as we go through here, just take a note to yourselves. Nothing Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount is reaffirming the Old Testament. Nothing. In fact, he's increasing it or doing away with parts of it, as we're going to see. So he says, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. Now, I have a video on this where I go through and talk about how we keep the fulfilled version of the law. So I'm going to post that down below if you want to see that. For assuredly, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law until all is fulfilled. Whoever therefore breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches men so shall be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does and teaches them, shall be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Now listen to this. For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven. Now, how is our righteousness supposed to exceed that of the Pharisees? Well, he's about to go on and tell us. You see, our righteousness has to go further than their righteousness. Their righteousness wasn't enough under the old covenant law. That's why Jesus had to amend the law, take away parts of it, and increase parts of it, because it wasn't enough. He showed us what righteousness truly is and truly is supposed to be. See, there were things that were permitted under the old covenant law that Jesus took away and no longer permitted. He starts off, he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not murder. Now, this is obviously from the Ten Commandments. There's no getting around this. He's just simply quoting from the Ten Commandments. And whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment. Let me ask you this. What is Jesus going to do? Is he going to say, hey, the Old Testament law says you shall not murder, and yeah, that's good enough. Okay, that's it. Yep, just follow that. No, he says, but I say, okay, let me just go ahead and tell you. When you say you heard it said, and then you follow it up with, but I say, what you're doing is you're very clearly changing something. There's no getting around that. It's the same thing if your kids come up to you and they say, hey, mommy said it was okay if I had ice cream. And you say, I know mommy said that, but I say, now, are you just going to follow that up with, I know mommy said that, but I say you can have it? Now, tell me what sense does that make? Because that's what these men want you to believe when we get to the adultery part of this, okay? That's how foolish this sounds. No, if you say, I know mommy said that, but I say, the clear implication is you're about to change something up. Yes, it was said, okay, the Old Testament said this. That's essentially what he's saying. The Old Testament said, you shall not murder. But I say to you, that whoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be danger of the judgment. So he took it further. He increased it. He didn't just leave it the same. No, friends. Same thing with the command of adultery, not commit adultery. Right here, again, one of the 10 commandments. You have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not commit adultery. This is a very clear, direct quote of one of the 10 commandments. But I say, here it is again. It says, but I say, you heard that it was said, but I say. So we know that he's about to change something. But I say to you that whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. See, he increased it. He changed it. Now, what these people want you to believe is that when we get right here, when we get to the third thing that he changed, that, oh, no, he just simply affirmed the old covenant. Old covenant was great. Everything's fine. Let's move along. Now, friends, we're going to see that is completely and utterly false. He says, furthermore, it has been said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. Now, again, this is clearly, undoubtedly quoting out of Deuteronomy 24. I mean, there's no other part of the law. In fact, Deuteronomy 24 is the only passage in the entire Old Testament that condones divorce and remarriage. Did you know that? It's the only passage in the Old Testament. So he has to be quoting from this right here, from Deuteronomy 24. So if he quotes from a passage and then says, but I say to you, is he just simply reaffirming? Is he just simply saying, you heard that it was said, Deuteronomy 24, but I say, yep, that was good. Does that make any sense to you? That's what these liars are wanting you to believe.
Deuteronomy 24.
Deuteronomy 24. Deuteronomy 24 is Deuteronomy 24.
And by the way, Deuteronomy 24.
He confirmed what Moses said.
Deuteronomy 24 is
Deuteronomy 24.
See, they're tricking you. They're bewitching you by taking you under the Mosaic law that Jesus clearly changed or increased here. And they're taking you back to that and saying, no, that was good enough. That was good enough. It's no different than if you came over here to the murder and adultery part and said, oh, hey, that's good enough. Just you shall not commit adultery. Hey, don't talk about this looking at women stuff, that being adultery. No, don't talk about that. Hey, let's just look at the 10 commandments and that's good enough, right? No, Jesus said, that's not good enough. That's the whole point of what he's doing on the Sermon on the Mount. This is how our righteousness exceeds that of the Pharisees, not stays the same, because the Pharisees were using Deuteronomy 24 to come to Jesus and excuse divorce and remarriage. But he said, but I say, it's very clearly changing the law here. Okay, and then the next one. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. Again, this is a quote straight out of the Old Testament. This is very clearly out of the Old Testament. You shall not swear falsely. But he says, but I say to you, do not swear at all. In the Old Covenant, it was permitted to swear. Just like I showed you, I believe it was in Deuteronomy 23. You could swear an oath. But now Jesus comes along and says, nope, don't do it at all. Neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is his footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black. But let your yes be yes and your no, no. This is very clear in James as well. You're not supposed to swear oaths. And these men would say, hey, look, because of this passage right here, even though it was permitted in the Old Testament, you can't swear oaths now. Now, isn't that interesting that they say that Jesus changed the law here, that he clearly was not going back to the Old Testament law, but they want you to believe the one right before that with adultery and remarriage. Oh, no, he didn't change that one though. Well, as we're going to see, every single one he changes, according to them, except this one, the one with divorce and remarriage. Now, isn't that just convenient? And it doesn't even flow with the text. I mean, guys, listen, am I giving you my opinion here? Am I showing you any of my own thoughts? No, listen. He clearly says the exact same thing for all 6 of these. But they want you to believe that this one is different for some reason. No. Yeah, he increased the other ones, and he did away with other Old Testament commands, except for this one right here. Well, isn't that convenient? Doesn't that just fit with their theology? But it's a complete twisting of Scripture. It's a very clear twisting of when he says, but I say to you. Okay, then there's another one here. Says, you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This is very clearly, again, straight out of the Old Testament, straight out of the law. This was permitted. You could do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I tell you, okay, so again, he's changing something. But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. See, he was clearly changing something. And some of these same men would say, if someone breaks in your house and tries to murder your children in front of you, you cannot hurt them. You can't do anything. No self-defense whatsoever. They take such a radical stance on that. But yet, when it comes to divorce and remarriage right here, they say, oh, no, he was just reaffirming the Old Testament. Well, again, isn't that convenient? Was he reaffirming the Old Testament here when he says eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth? No, you see, these men are deceiving you. They're very clearly and undoubtedly deceiving you, trying to put you under the Mosaic law, which Jesus says was not enough to make you righteous. Okay, the last one here says, you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies, bless those who curse you, do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use you and persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. So in the Old Covenant, there were actually passages talking about how, I believe it was in Psalms, talking about how he hated people. You could actually kill your enemies. In fact, there were times where God told the Israelites to go to war and even kill women and children of their enemies. So yes, it was permitted back in the Old Covenant to actually kill your enemies. It was permitted for a time. But Jesus comes along and says, but I say. Now, does that mean that it's still permitted? When he says, but I say, of course not, friends. And these guys know this. These guys are deceiving you because they know that every single one of these, Jesus increased or changed. Again, they'll say, except the one on divorce and remarriage. Now, think about that. If that isn't enough to get you upset, then you must not be listening, because go back and play it. Go back and listen to what they said. And don't say that I'm taking them out of context or anything. You can ask for the videos, but don't falsely accuse me of taking them out of context. It's very clear what they said, that we're under Deuteronomy 24, that we have to go by that. Jesus did not change anything. In fact, he just doubled down on Deuteronomy 24.
This scripture has not passed away. This is almost exactly the same thing Jesus is giving in Matthew 19.
I don't even think he's really adding anything or going deeper to what Deuteronomy 24 says. I think really he's just reaffirming it. That sounds exactly like Deuteronomy 24 to me. It almost sounds like he's just putting it in different words. He's not quoting it verbatim, but he's promoting the same exact doctrine.
And by the way, Deuteronomy 24 with marriage, that's moral. God hasn't changed his mind on that. When Jesus came in the flesh, he just clarified it.
Christ didn't overrule. He confirmed what Moses said.
Deuteronomy 24 is one of the reasons why I take the permissive view. Now, it's not the only thing, but it's one of the things.
Not a new thought. That's not a new truth. That's Deuteronomy 24 all over again. That's Matthew chapter 5, verse 32. The same statement exactly is made there. It's nothing new.
Friends, how can you read this and come to that conclusion? Only if you have an agenda to push. Only if you don't want to see the truth, to see the light. That's the only reason you come to this. Because look at this right here. Here are the 6 things we just went over. Murder, adultery, divorce and remarriage, oaths, eye for an eye, love your neighbor, hate your enemy. These are the 6 things that Jesus addressed in Sermon on the Mount. So the first 2, he increased the law. Then the last 3, he did away with. No more oaths. Don't take any oaths at all. No more eye for an eye, and no more saying love your neighbor but hate your enemy. So the third one right here. The third one. Did he increase the law on this one, or did he do away with it? That's the question. Or do you want to believe what these men are saying and go with, well, he just left it the same? Is that really what you're going to believe? Are you really going to believe them on this? Or did Jesus do the exact same thing with the third thing here as he did with the others. He either increased it or did away with it. Which one? Which one? Well, as I'm going to show you, he did away with it. He said it was permitted to divorce your wives and hand them a certificate of divorce. But I say, he clearly did away with it. He didn't just keep going with the status quo. In fact, Matthew 19, that was the context. They came to him essentially saying, hey, what about Deuteronomy 24? And Jesus did not just reaffirm it. And you may ask, okay, so why were things permitted in the Old Testament? Why were things like polygamy, taking oaths, killing your enemies, why were these things permitted in the Old Testament? Well, Acts tells us, truly, these times of ignorance God overlooked. This isn't me saying this. This is Paul saying this. God overlooked these things, but now commands all men everywhere to repent. So there was a time when he overlooked. See, polygamy was not God's ideal plan. It wasn't since the garden, Adam and Eve. It was permitted, just like divorce and remarriage, it was permitted for a time, just in Deuteronomy 24. That's it. But if you look through the entire rest of the Old Covenant law, you see it was definitely not God's will. And that's why Jesus goes back to Genesis. That's why he goes beyond Deuteronomy 24, because Deuteronomy 24 was a permission. It was God overlooking in times of ignorance. But now he commands all men everywhere to repent. Now he commands all men not to take up arms against your enemy, not to take oaths, not to do eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, and not to divorce and remarry. He put an end to it. He said, that's enough. It's very clear if you just look at the context of Matthew 5. That's what he was doing. This is how your righteousness can exceed that of the Pharisees. Now, what I wanted to do is just look at Matthew 19. Let's just look at the context. It's very similar to Matthew 5 in that Deuteronomy 24 is clearly brought up again before we get to the exception clause. It says, so then, they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So Jesus is saying, don't do it. So as far as divorce, they came up and asked him about divorce. His answer was, don't do it. Do not separate. And that's what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 7. That's Paul's summary of what Jesus said. Do not depart. They said to him, why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? Now, what were they quoting here? Again, Deuteronomy 24 is the only time in the Old Covenant that divorce and remarriage are permitted. It's the only passage that they can go to that talks about this specifically. So they're very clearly quoting from Deuteronomy 24. That's why I said you really need to know and understand Deuteronomy 24. Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce and to put her away? They're saying, hey, Jesus, wait, don't divorce? What about Deuteronomy 24? Okay, that's exactly what these men would say to you today. If you said, hey, listen, no divorce, what would be the first thing likely they would say? Hey, what about Deuteronomy 24? And that's what I showed you. That's what they try to do, take you back to Deuteronomy 24. So ironically, they're taking the side of the Pharisees. Think about that. This is the position the Pharisees held when Moses permitted it, but now God commands all men everywhere to repent. See, it was permitted, as we're going to see, but it wasn't ideal. And Jesus came along and took it away. Sermon on the Mount. You heard that it was said, but I say. It's very clearly changing something. So you can't just incorporate Deuteronomy 24 and say, oh, he just went with Deuteronomy 24. No, he says, but I say. And right here, he said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, listen to this, permitted you. Listen to that word, permitted. It was permitted for a time. He permitted you to divorce your wives. But from the beginning, it was not so. And I say to you, so here it is again, very similar to Sermon on the Mount. You heard that it was said, Deuteronomy 24, but I say. Jesus is doing something very similar here. He says, and I say to you, whoever divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another commits adultery, and whoever marries her who is divorced commits adultery. And his disciples were shocked. His disciples said to him, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Now think about this. Why, if Jesus was simply just going along with Deuteronomy 24, which is what the Pharisees were already operating under, think about it. Why would they be so shocked? They were already using Deuteronomy 24. Do you see that? It's right here. Okay, look, go back. Right here. He said to them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, permitted you to divorce your wives. Where was this permitted? Deuteronomy 24. It's clear as day. Certificate of divorce talked about right here. Why then did Moses command to give a certificate of divorce? And by the way, he didn't command it. Again, it was permitted. But they're clearly talking about Deuteronomy 24. That's the context. So for someone to say that the Pharisees came up to Jesus and were asking about Deuteronomy 24, and Jesus just says, oh, yep, hey, Deuteronomy 24, yep, that's it, just go with that. Why would his disciples be so shocked at that? Are you telling me they were shocked that Jesus quoted Deuteronomy 24 and said, yep, hey, whatever Deuteronomy 24 says? Are you telling me that this would shock the disciples to the point where they would say this? If such is the case of the man with his wife, it is better not to marry. Now think about that. They're saying it's better not to get married. Why? Because it would be better not to marry than to be stuck in a marriage where you could not divorce. That's the clear implication here. That's clear as day. There's no disputing what I'm saying, that they're quoting out of Deuteronomy 24, that they're clearly shocked. And the only way they could be shocked is if he took a position different than Deuteronomy 24. There's no way that you can say he just doubled down on Deuteronomy 24, sided with the Pharisees who came to him, and his disciples were shocked that he knew and quoted Deuteronomy 24 and went along with it. No, friends, these men are deceiving you. So please check out my first video, my intro video that I have on this. Don't worry, I'll get to Matthew 5:32 in more detail. God willing, I'll get to Matthew 19 more in detail. We got a lot to cover with this, so just be patient. I know that a lot of people are out there itching to hear, but again, we have to go through the context to see for sure what it's not. And there's no way it was just a doubling down, a reaffirming of Deuteronomy 24. Given the evidence that I've shown you today. So the question is, are you just going to side with them and just ignore all the context that I just gave you? Or are you going to say, okay, there's no way he's siding with Deuteronomy 24, so what is he saying then? That's what, God willing, I hope to talk about soon. Check out those videos. That's all I got for today. God bless.